Hello all, it's been a while since my last episode, and this was mostly due to just everything becoming too much to handle all at once, but I've got a good plan in place to keep the episodes coming at a consistent basis. So right now the plan is for me to keep working on episodes every weekend, and new episodes will be released every 2 weeks. I think this is a good schedule because I don't think the show works too well for a weekly format, since the aim is for me to take a deep dive on these various games from the past, and the quality wasn't where I wanted it to be in like previous episodes, so I wanted to give myself more time to work on them and really kind of dissect each episode. So I do want to do other things for the channel, however, that could fill the gaps in between memory card episodes, but for now, just look forward to new memory card episodes every 2 weeks, and with that, let's get to the 5th episode of the series. In the early days of video games, mainframe computers were amongst the primary ways that video games were developed, and we've already covered several mainframe games including Hammurabi, Marion Bad, the Sumerian Game, and Star Trek 1971. However, there are a few more mainframe games that I wanted to touch on. I decided to group these games all together because they may not otherwise have enough of content to warrant their own episodes, but they still deserve to be talked about on the show as they were essential in the early days of video games. So today we talk about Hunt the Wumpus, Empire, and Colossal Cave Adventures. Welcome to Memory Card, the History of Video Games, a series where we take a chronological look at video game history under a microscope lens. I'm not here to just talk about video games from the past, but also look at how they were made and who made them. I also take a look at other historical events in video game history and the influential people within the gaming industry. So welcome to Memory Card, the History of Video Games, and today we look at some mainframe games. Hunt the Wumpus is first up on our list today, and much like the games we've discussed and the games made around this time, it is a text-based game. It was created by Gregory Yaub, and sorry if I mispronounced that name, in 1973, and the game is often regarded as the first survival horror video game long before the days of Resident Evil and Silent Hill. Yaub was inspired by the games published in the People's Computer Company, and he wanted to make a game that was different than the standard 10x10 grid at the time. He wanted a game that did not use a grid at all. He came up with the Wumpus monster and the idea of the player traversing through rooms in a cave with the monster hiding in one of those rooms. Yaub went with the layout of what is called a I don't even know how to say this word. Cadron? I don't know why I had an accent there. Which had a total of 20 rooms, according to this map of the game. Originally, the Wumpus did not move, and Yaub found it pretty boring, so he made the Wumpus able to move, and after that, he sent a copy written in BASIC to People's Computer Company. Later that year, Yaub went to a conference at Stanford University, and much to his surprise, many of the people were playing his game. Even later that year, People's Computer Company published the game in its November 1973 issue. There are several versions of Hunt the Wumpus, and Yaub made sequels called Wumpus 2 and Wumpus 3. The second game had a different arrangement for the caves, and the third added more hazards. One of the versions that was written in the C computer language can be found on modern BSD and Linux operating systems today in the BSD Games package. In terms of gameplay, it is rather simple since it is text-based. There are 20 rooms or caves, and in one of the caves is the titular monster. However, there are other hazards as 2 of the caves contain bottomless pits and another 2 contain what are called superbats. The superbats pick up the player and move them to a random cave. Each cave is connected to 3 other caves. So the game is turn-based, and each turn starts by telling the player which cave they are currently in. The player has a few options on each turn, including moving to a new cave or shooting a crooked arrow. The player has only 5 of these arrows, so they have to be very selective about firing these. In terms of the setting, the player is immersed in complete darkness, and the game states that the player can smell a wumpus, hear a bat, or feel a draft from a pit in one of the 3 connected caves. If the player enters a cave with a pit, that's game over. If the player enters a cave with the wumpus will either move to a new cave or stay to kill the player. If the player decides to fire a crooked arrow, the player decides which caves it will fly through, with a selection of up to 5. The arrow can also hit the player and end the game. But the arrow can also hit the wumpus, which is how you win. And if it doesn't hit anything, then the wumpus will move to a new cave. If the wumpus ever moves to a cave the player is in, that's also game over. There's not much of the game beyond that, but it does sound fun in hunting the wumpus with the additional hazards. Yob was definitely thinking beyond the grid formula for games around this time and truly wanted to make something that was different. And just describing the game, it really does feel like he accomplished this. So now let's take a look at a game called Empire, which came out in 1977. So as a child, Walter Bright was fascinated with games like Risk, Stratego, and the film Battle of Britain. He created a board game based on all of these. Further down the line, he decided that a computer could do the gameplay. The first version of Empire was written in BASIC. However, in 1977, it was rewritten in Fortran for the PDP-10 computer at Caltech. The game became a sensation on other PDP-10 computers, and Bright later recoded the game in assembly language. It was made available commercially, but only sold 2 copies. The unexpected then happened. Someone broke through the security systems at Caltech and stole the source code for the game. The code jumped around before eventually being found on a computer in Massachusetts by Herb Jacobs and Dave Minton. They then ported the game for the VAC/VMS operating system. The game was submitted to DESIS, I think it's pronounced, which its programs often were a part of the initial games installed on DEC computers. Thus, Empire continued to spread. When Bright caught wind of this, he contacted DESIS in 1983, and they gave Bright credit for the game in the catalog description, and he was added back into the source code. So it was a happy ending for Bright. The game continued to have different versions made throughout the 80s. At the same time as these other versions, Bright was working on his own as he ported it to an IBM PC. He wrote several software companies in order to get the game commercially sold, but it was Interstel who bought. Mark Baldwin co-authored the game and redesigned it. The game, now called Empire War Game of the Century, was made available on the Atari ST, Amiga, Commodore 64, Apple II, Macintosh, and DOS. In the early 90s, Mark Baldwin and Bob Rakowski rewrote the game again, this time dubbing it Empire Deluxe. This version was available for DOS, Mac, and Windows. The game also featured an expansion pack called Empire Deluxe Scenarios in 1993, which added a map and scenario statistics tool, a map randomizer tool, patches for the DOS and Windows versions, and 37 different scenarios. There was also a sequel which was named Empire 2: The Art of War, published by New World Computing and was playable on DOS and Windows. So that's where the complicated history of Empire ends. Bright originally created the game, and as time went on, the game changed several hands before it landed into Mark Baldwin's, who continued its commercial success in the 90s. In 1996, Computer Gaming World said the original Empire created by Bright was the 8th best computer game ever released and the 2nd best computer war game released by 1996, sitting behind Panzer General. The game was immensely popular, and there are even modern ports for current PC operating systems on Walter Bright's classic Empire page. Sid Meier, who created the Civilization series, has said Empire was a big inspiration for his own hit video game series that hopefully we get to touch on a much later episode. With the history out of the way, let's talk about gameplay. So each game starts with a random map and is laid out on a grid. The map consists of islands, a random distribution of cities, and the players start controlling one of these cities each. The area around the city is visible, but the overall map is blacked out, which is a common gameplay mechanic in Grand War strategy games today. Cities can be used to build armies, aircraft, and ships. Each takes a certain number of turns to produce these units, and armies are usually the quickest. Players can move their units on the map to explore a map, and other cities can be discovered and captured by the player's armies. The overall goal of the game is to completely conquer the map and capture the other computer players' territories. It is much in the same vein as Risk, but instead of a roll of the dice, it is a computer doing the work. That's pretty much it for Empire. It has such a complicated history for such a simple game. I'm glad that Bright was able to get the credit he deserved for creating such a game that is influential to war strategy games even to today. So now we approach the last game that we'll look at today, which is called Colossal Cave Adventures, and you may or may not have heard of it, but you've more than likely heard of Adventure for the Atari 2600. Colossal Cave Adventures directly inspired that game. So Colossal Cave Adventures was created by William Crowther in the 70s. William and his wife Patricia were cave explorers and programmers. They had explored the Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, which is known as the longest cave system in the world. Alongside their caving expeditions, they also produced vector map surveys of the caves. A teleprinter then sent and printed these maps and was connected to a PDP-1 mainframe computer. The data was then inserted into a program that was developed by both William and Patricia that generated plotting commands onto punch tape. This punch tape was then inputted into a Honeywell 316 mini computer attached to a Calcomp drum plotter at Bolt, Beranek, and Newman to print paper maps. There's a lot of different names for computers at this time. There were some of the earliest computer-drawn maps of caves. However, the two divorced, and William stopped going on caving expeditions. Eventually, he worked on a text-based game in the Fortran programming language for a PDP-10 mainframe computer which interfaced with a teleprinter. He was inspired by his time surveying caves such as the Mammoth Cave system and the 1975 maps of the Bedquill area of caves, which included Colossal Cavern. He also liked the Dungeons & Dragons campaigns and decided to design a game that focused on exploring caves for treasure. One of his primary goals was accessibility, so that those that weren't caught up on the technology could play. He developed a natural language input system to control the game, which he said, quote, gave the illusion anyway that you type in English commands and it did what you said, end quote. Once the game was complete, he showed it to his coworkers at BBN, and he essentially thought he was done with it. Well, while he was on vacation, the game spread amongst the ARPANET network and was being played at other companies and universities. One of the many people that played the game was Don Woods, who played it at Stanford University. After contacting William for the source code, he added onto the game to include a lot of fantasy elements, including a dragon, more puzzles, and a pirate. This new version also now included a scoring system and more opportunities to collect treasure. Woods continued releasing updated versions of the game all the way up to 1995. Much like other games at this time, several different versions floated around after its release, and there were so many different versions that an article in Your Computing dubbed them adventure games, and there was an adventure writing kit program for the ZX81 computer that could be used to generate a game with similar aspects of gameplay. In 2007, Eric S. Raymond released a port of Woods' 1995 version to create Open Adventure and release the source code under an open source license. Commercially, the game was released by Microsoft as Microsoft Adventure in 1979 for the Apple II Plus and TRS-80 computers, and eventually MS-DOS for IBM PCs. The original adventure was released by Software Toolworks and is the only version which Crowther and Woods received money for. Level 9 Computing released several versions as Colossal Adventure for the NASCOM. Most recently, there was also a 3D remake of Colossal Cave released by Cygnus Entertainment for Windows, macOS, Linux, Nintendo Switch, PS5, Series X, and MetaQuest 2. It was designed by Ken and Roberta Williams, and Roberta stated that the game was meant to be a recreation of how she felt playing the original game in 1979. Arguably, Colossal Cave Adventure is considered one of the most influential video games in history. It was recently inducted into the World Video Game Hall of Fame in 2019. It was influential in how adventure fiction games developed. Historian Alexander Smith also stated that alongside Star Trek and Lunar Lander, the game was essentially on every computer. The game would go on to inspire other games such as Zork, Adventureland, Mystery House, and eventually Adventure for the Atari 2600. But we could talk about the history and influential nature of Colossal Cave Adventure for hours, so let's get into the gameplay aspects. Like other games, this is a text-based game, and the player explores a cave that contains treasure. There are several puzzles within the cave that the player has to solve to progress. Solving these puzzles includes using items that are found while exploring. The player uses 1 or 2 word commands to move through the cave and interact with objects. Each room within the cave has a name associated with it, along with a description and items or puzzles it has. The narrator, aka the program, acts in the same way as a dungeon master for tabletop games and responds in a more human-like way, providing a conversational experience. Crowther's version of the game, which we'll primarily talk about, had 5 treasures in total within the cave. The layout of the map was based on a real cave system, but the fantasy elements also included a crystal bridge, magic words, and dwarves. The dwarves are an enemy in the game that can kill the player, but the player can also die by falling into a pit. As stated, Woods' version added 10 more treasures to the game, more fantasy elements, and a point system. The goal changed from not just finding treasure, but reaching the maximum number of points, which was 350 in the 1977 version. And that wraps up the Mainframe games that I wanted to discuss. All 3 of these games have such interesting history, and they all influence the rest of gaming history in some form or fashion. In a way, we take a look at the pioneering games for several genres, including horror, grand strategy, and adventure. These games played a pivotal role in how gaming history played out, and I hope you learned as much as I did about these games. On the next episode, we'll take a look at several Play-Doh games. Play-Doh was a computer system that has its fair share of influential games as well. So, see you then. As always, please go check out the sources that I've linked in the description. Without these sources, there would be no episodes. So definitely go read into more of the stories I've talked about. I always just touch the surface because I have a limited amount of time, and there's so much to go beyond what I just talked about. As I said, I could spend an eternity talking about what games were inspired by Colossal Cave Adventure and how many different versions there were. I really enjoyed this episode though because I got to learn about some games that I didn't know existed but had a direct impact on a lot of the games that I play today. It is fascinating to learn the games that pioneered what we gamers enjoy right now. It's one of the aspects that I love about this series.